It has been commonly believed that agriculture was developed to better feed growing populations, and beer was a happy byproduct of that development. However, over the last few decades, support has grown strong for the beer before bread model that puts alcohol production as the driving force, or at least a major factor, for the interest in farming. Earlier thinking on the development of agriculture held that while humans started gathering grains over 100,000 years ago, early farmers began planting them around 11,500 years ago. This caused a food surplus, which allowed for permanent population centers. It was believed that not long after these settlements had been founded, the recipe for beer, the earliest known version of alcoholic beverage, was discovered. Perhaps some of the excess bread mash that was now available had been left out too long and allowed to ferment. In the 1950s, a new theory emerged. This was that beer had been discovered first, and that it was humanity's desire for beer that started the interest in selecting and breeding crops. This theory was first proposed by Robert Braidwood and Jonathan Saurer. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. As Braidwood put it in a letter to colleagues, could the discovery that a mash of fermented grain yielded a palatable and nutritious beverage have acted as a greater stimulant toward the experimental selection and breeding of the cereals than the discovery of flour and bread making? For the next several decades, this theory, although not outright dismissed, was not given mainstream support. That would change in the 21st century. The first hard evidence for the beer before bread theory came in 2010. Pottery shards, showing evidence of fermentation from 7,000 to 9,000 years ago, were found at the Jiahu site in modern China. A few years later, scientists found evidence that the Natufian culture of the Levant, including modern-day Turkey, Syria, Israel, Jordan, and Lebanon, were brewing beer more than 13,000 years ago, more than 3,000 years before the development of agriculture. The Natufian culture was one of the earliest civilizations of history, perhaps the very first sedentary civilization in the world. While still comprising groups of hunter-gatherers, the Natufians would come together periodically for large feast rituals. During this time, they would eat, make religious sacrifices, play music and dance, broker marriages, and, like at every good party, drink. With bread as a staple food still millennia away, some scholars argue that the biggest motivation for these hunter-gatherers to hunker down and work at producing shelf-stable food was to brew enough beer to drink their fill at these feasts. Regardless of motivation, what is clear is that the brewing process was a community effort, thus sowing the seeds of non-family communities. Perhaps more convincingly in the beer before bread theory is the fact that the particular tools and varieties of crops that were developed earliest lend themselves more towards alcohol production than to making bread or other staple food making. This is true not just in the Levant, but across the world. In Central and South America, teosinte was farmed before the domestication of corn, also known as maize. Teosinte makes very poor corn flour, but it does make good booze and is still used for that purpose today. Interestingly, there is even evidence that in areas where alcohol production was not prevalent, other intoxicants that took the place of alcohol were similarly the early catalysts for agriculture. There is evidence for this in North and South America with tobacco cultivation, and in Australia with pituri, a local tobacco-like stimulant. Research continues in the beer before bread versus the agriculture ahead of alcohol debate, and the matter has not been conclusively settled. But more and stronger evidence for the beer before bread hypothesis has brought that argument firmly into the mainstream, and it now has strong support. Our modern world is far removed from the hunter-gatherer days of yore. The majority of humans now live in cities that we call concrete jungles, with millions of people, towering skyscrapers, and bright lights that no ancient hunter could have ever dreamt of. But one of the oldest traditions is still alive in these cities. And the next time you crack open a cold one with some friends, maybe take a moment to reflect on all those who have done so before you, and that maybe it was the desire for a brewski that built your city.